Jason, thank you for joining me. As I was just saying before we hit record, it has been a very long time since we had any interaction, but we did, run into each other in person, I guess I might say. So since it has been a long time, I'll start with first, where does today's recording find you?
Yeah, so I'm usually always in New York City or right outside New York City or it's my favorite place to be. It's my favorite state of mind, and today that's where I'm working.
Having said that, it's been a bit since we had much interaction or conversation or whatever you want to call it. Can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm an art student that went into the agency space, right? So I was designer, I was a creative lead, and then I started my own company, Social Fresh, back in 2008. Um, Social Fresh is a marketing conference and an agency, and we've been doing that work ever since. But I think in terms of what do I do each day, I'm typically either a strategist or I'm the kind of idea person creative in the room. And I think that overlaps quite a bit. But we work for clients that do a lot of digital marketing, strategy research, paid media. We run a conference which is the first original social media conference, which I believe is where we met first, if Twitter doesn't count. And um, I write about creativity and I write about marketing. And those are where I spend most of my days thinking.
When I asked you about your location, you talked about New York. And I think I recall that in your book, which was published this year, if I recall correctly, you say something about generally wanting to be or being attracted to a very walkable city. And I can't remember if you talk about New York in that way, but is that some of your attraction to New York?
I mean, it's definitely one of my favorite things about New York City. It's probably the most walkable city in the States. In the book, I do mention Florence or something in Italy or Spain. I mean, every town in Italy is very walkable for the most part. But Florence is a great example because you can walk across the whole city of Florence in like 30 minutes to most places, maybe 40, 45 if you stretch it. Um, but yeah, the first time I landed in New York, it felt like home to me, even though I still hadn't learned how to use the subway and accidentally landed in Queens somehow. Um, but it's just, there's an energy to it. Beyond that, there's an energy to it and there's an attitude. And I think, people are more likely to just be solving or building, or being creative in some way in New York City than a lot of places. And I love that. And I thrive on that vibe.
You talking about some of your attraction to New York City, it feels to me like this relates to some of the things that you talk about in your book. And we might back up and describe the book a bit at some point, but I forget where I came upon this conjecture, I guess, but I recall reading a book and someone was making the argument that one of the reasons that you see more innovation and creativity in New York City proper, I guess I might say, than you do across the river in New Jersey, something like that, is because you have so many people packed into such a small space that different kinds of people are running into one another. And the differences, so like two people with different specialties or sets of experience or whatever are what create novel ideas. And alongside this, they gave the example of Watson and Crick and kind of the race for the discovery of DNA, more or less. And basically what they said was at the time you had a lot of solo researchers, more or less, that were running their own labs and they had their own students that were specialized in their sort of niche. And even if they were talking to their students or other people, it was all people with similar backgrounds. Whereas Watson and Crick had slightly different specialties. I forget exactly what they were, but I think one of them was maybe a zoologist and the other one was a molecular biologist or something of that nature. And so they had slightly different knowledge sets. And then they would go and walk through a park or take lunch together. And it was the different perspectives that they had on research that this person was saying helped them find novel approaches to discovering the structure of DNA. And I realize this is sadly a much longer story than it probably needed to be. But as you're talking about New York City, and I forget the terminology that you use, but you know, creativity or some vibrancy or whatever else, you remind me a bit of reading that argument.
Yeah, I mean, you want variety for ideas to be new or novel. And if you are working with people or are surrounded by people that all think the same way or are risk averse, then that's harder to do. To get a divergent perspective, to break patterns, you need a larger variety of things that you're interacting with, and cities provide that. Um, I think New York is also interesting because there's a lot of arts centered in New York City, whether it's theater or even the ad agency space. Mad Men, Madison Avenue, um, music industry. There's a thriving art market, art world in New York City with so many galleries and museums, but it is also the variety of the people that are coming to a city or coming to a location or coming to an office or a workplace. Um, if they are, or even, if you drill down even more, if you're having a meeting, if you're having a brainstorm meeting or some type of creative project and you have 6 people in the room, studies show, the data shows that if 3 of those people are not normally working together on the same team, that's kind of the optimal makeup of a creative project or brainstorm team. If all 6 people are from the same team that work with each other every day, there's less variety of thought. There's less chance of something new or novel happening in that meeting. So I think there's also a similar study on Broadway that the Broadway plays that have made the most money, that arguably are the most kind of creative and interesting, are the ones that have like 2 people that have worked together before, but maybe 2 other key players that are new and have not worked with that team before. So you see this pattern repeated everywhere, and I think those things are more like what you're describing happens all the time, but I think it's more likely to happen in places where you have a diversity of talent and thinking and perspectives.
I forget how much you talk about this in your book, but you at least reference that a lot of brainstorming sessions or something like that in companies tend to quote unquote fail, whatever failure means exactly. We don't get to our goals or we don't get really creative thinking or something of that nature. And so you just said, there is sort of an optimal mix of bringing in people from different teams or the outside or whatever. So uh, this may be too specific of a question, so please take it more broadly if you feel like it's helpful. But do you think that when it comes to innovation or creative thinking or brainstorming in a lot of companies, that very often it tends to quote unquote fail because it's just the creative team that gets together, or it's just, an engineering team and not people from diverse backgrounds, so to speak?
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, I think there's certain realities in a lot of corporate America office jobs that you can't really the ideal creative team and brainstorm meeting is an ideal. You don't have to reach it every time. Like you don't have to go through 3 hours of a creative process to come up with the title of a blog post, right? Like not every project deserves a ton of work. So it depends on the goal, depends on the size of the creative challenge. Um, Giving creative teams creative control is not a bad thing inherently, but I think it's good to know these things and know like, our ideas lately have not been great. What can we do to spice things up? What can we do to break patterns? Um, and on a bigger project, I think it does make sense to bring in someone from accounting or legal or PR or whatever it is, someone from a different team or outside help. I mean, I run an agency. It's essentially one of the, I think, core capabilities of an agency to come in and be that outside voice, that new perspective. Um, so there's a lot of ways to do these things. I will say, I think most of, to your larger question, why are companies bad at creativity on a consistent basis, which I would agree. There's 2 things. Number one, you don't, not everything a company needs to do not everything a company does needs to be creative. But I do think generally what is happening is most companies don't give permission or time or resources or uh, the kind of recommendation or belief in risk taking on many levels, and they see risk taking in creative. They see it as risk, whereas risk taking is kind of a requirement for a creative process. So, companies get comfortable. They like patterns. They like repeatable process. And, that is kind of the antithesis to creative outputs. So I think you have to pick your fights a little bit. You have to decide if our company is not standing out compared to our competitors, where can we really focus to change that? And who needs the permission and the resources to be able to do that consistently? And that comes from leadership. And, that's giving people permission to spend more time on very specific kind of creative challenges is the key.
Okay, let me back up a little bit real quick because there are a number of things that I want to ask you about. But having read your book, I would love in length or in brief if you would tell me how you describe your book.
So the book is The Case for More Bad Ideas. It is the counterintuitive guide to creativity. I wrote the book because I've been a creative like my whole career and my whole life, and I've had permission to be creative. And it took me a while to figure out that most people don't. But my upbringing, my parents, my schooling, my career path has all allowed me more permission to be creative in life. And, as you learn creative skills, as you define your own creative kind of habits and process, I think you stumble upon the fact that it is a very counterintuitive place to spend your thinking hours. And I think the reason I wrote the book is I wanted to give permission for more people to be able to make those investments and take those risks because creativity is kind of the point. It's kind of why it's the fun part of the job, right? And everybody um, kind of is scared of creativity. There's even studies that say when you are the creative person in the room or you say something a little divergent, that it puts people on their heels a little bit because there is that risk of averseness that we all have, especially in office culture. Even if you can't, even if you don't acknowledge it, it's like a subconscious thing sometimes. So I think teaching people that anyone can be more creative, I think is a very worthwhile thing to put your effort into. So that's the purpose of the book, is just giving people more permission to believe that creativity is a skill. It can be learned. It can be practiced, and it's not a gift, and it's not something that should be a worrying point for you in your career or your life in general. It's the fun part of the job.
When you wrote this book, I think you say in here that it took you quite a few years to pull everything together. Were you trying to encapsulate, years of learning? Were you trying to make an argument for, like you say, the case for more bad ideas? And were you trying to make a case for something, or what was the goal of the book?
Yeah, I mean, my goal was simply to give that freedom to other people. I think when I work with people, I can see the things that they're missing in their creative process, or I can see them holding themselves back a little bit. If you're training someone for your agency, if you're working with a client, if you're we train speakers up to put on stage at Social Fresh Conference. Like, everyone has this creative potential. A lot of people lack the confidence or the time or the belief that they can achieve a certain level of success or creativity. Um, and I see a lot of bad advice out there. I am making the case. I'm making the case for kind of second guessing your assumptions about your own creative abilities, um, and giving you very specific interventions. The whole book is just a list of interventions. It's more of a toolbox than it is like a specific 1, 2, 3 step recipe. Each person will get something different out of it. I think they'll get like 2 or 3 things that'll fit their creative process or the way they work. And I think allow people to really change the way they think about ideas and solving creative problems.
When I read the title, the case for more bad ideas, and then going through the book, I forgive me if you state this explicitly, and I'm just remembering it as sort of my interpretation, but I thought of the quote, or I forget where it comes from. Maybe it's not an exact quote, but the idea that the only way out is through. And in the sense that, you know, again, maybe you state this explicitly and I just forgot, but in the sense that the way to get to better ideas, more creative thinking, some innovation, however we want to phrase it, is that you have to experiment. You have to throw out ideas that may turn out to be bad. But if you're, let's say, afraid to have a bad idea, or if your organization punishes you, then it's kind of difficult to get to the other side where you do end up with innovation or good ideas. Is that did you state that explicitly, and or am I thinking of it properly?
No, I mean, the whole so one of the core chapters is actually how do you incorporate bad ideas into your creative process. And that, is the book is about that, but it's also more about ideas. It's just a general kind of call to action of the counterintuitive nature of creativity. But one of the many reasons bad ideas work in brainstorming is because they are easier to come up with. They have no downside. Like if I ask you for a bad idea and you come up with a terrible idea, you succeeded, right? So there's, it takes, and that, believe it or not, it takes a little practice to be able to come up with bad ideas. When you ask someone to write down, a list of 25 bad ideas in 10 minutes, they will actually do this weird human nature thing of, all right, I want to find the best bad idea, like the perfect bad idea. And that's like kind of the antithesis of what I'm asking you to do. What you're trying to get people to do is just put down anything that comes to mind and take away that judgment layer of their brain that we all have by default. And that's it doesn't take long to kind of learn that. But I give examples of what bad ideas really are. Something can be too expensive, something can be too dangerous, something can be too boring. It can be an idea you think is too obvious that other people will have thought of, which is another bad assumption because we do come up with different ideas quite a bit. So I think, thinking about that, you know, writing your way out of a problem or working your way through a problem. I think the key is that creativity is not passive. It's not waiting for an idea to come to you. I mean, that is incubation. That does happen, but it's not a passive activity. It actually requires action. So my whole POV is, creativity is work. It can be learned. It takes practice. But it's an active skill. It's not a passive skill. So if you're not actively starting a creative process with, all right, let's write down 10 bad ideas. Let's, actively bring together a constraint questions process for this where we, there's a lot of examples of things in the book, a lot of interventions that you can use like that, that start you thinking in different directions and break your own personal patterns. So it's work. It takes practice, but it's fun work, and it just requires you to kind of think about things a little differently. It's not what we typically do each day.
You argue in the book that creativity is a learned skill, more or less, or at least I think that I understood that. And that caused me to think about how I believe that, having worked in marketing for 20 something years, that whether it's marketers or just generally, I think a lot of people view the creative, the artist, as being someone who is inspired. And when they're not inspired, they're just sitting around thinking, or they're waiting for inspiration to strike. And I think a lot of people that desire to be creative don't have discipline. They don't have a practice or maybe multiple practices, like I forget the word you used, but you said something along the lines of tool set or a toolbox. And so I think the general society, sort of think of like, if you have a discipline, if you have a practice, a process, that then suddenly that's going to stop you from being creative. And so as I was reading this statement or argument, I was really curious how you think about just someone's natural inclination to be creative versus what we often see as being the polar opposite, which is a lot of discipline. And then where I think, you know, if we want to think of this as being binary, which I don't think we have to, but if you wanted to, it would, I think you often find real creativity in the middle between those things because you have to have a discipline. You have to have the skill to be creative, but you have to have some of that discipline in order to actually execute and not just have an idea. So I don't even know if I have a question as much as is you caused me to think this, and I'm curious how you interpret that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so part of this is like a nature versus nurture question. Are you born creative or not? I think some people are born with a certain type of artistic skill. There are people that have a kind of an innate ability to sing. I'm a terrible singer. I am not on that end of that spectrum. I'm not a great illustrator, and yet I'm a trained artist. But illustration is something that some people are born with, but you can also learn. Like if you practice illustration every day, you can become a really good illustrator. So I think both are true. I think some people have a certain type of skill, but even if you have a certain type of, you're gifted with some type of artistic ability, if you don't use it, you don't become creative. Um, Creativity comes from the most creative people in the world are the people that are solving the most creative challenges on a daily basis. It's people that are painters or are singer-songwriters or work in an ad agency or, for whatever reason, it can be engineers. It's people that have creative challenges that come to them on a regular basis and they actively practice that skill set and use it. Um, so in order to, if you haven't been given that permission, if you haven't been put in a creative field, you do have to find that way to practice somehow. And that doesn't mean you had to become a painter or a writer, but you have to do something that's creative problem solving. I think the other part of your question is, you know, the balance of kind of a natural ability versus process. I mean, I think natural ability, natural inclination to be creative is just permission. It's a first step, whereas process is important, but I define creativity as work. It does take these active kind of patterns in your life to really perfect it, but it's not a 12-step program. It's not a 10 clear steps along a path that you have to get right. It's just repeated challenging of assumptions, really, and kind of building up um, kind of a curiosity of the world around you.
Some of what you were talking about early on, and then even just a moment ago, I think if I can restate it, it sounds to me like, or summarize maybe, it sounds to me like when you say that creativity is work, for example, or when you even just talk about being creative, that what's implied maybe is that someone doesn't just have a creative idea or that they're out of the box thinker, but it sounds to me like you're saying something actually gets done beyond idea generation. Is that fair generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think consistent practice is important. Working on problems for a long time. The biggest ideas typically come from people who've worked on it for years or decades. The active piece of it is just consistency. Consistent practice is what makes creativity a skill. And that happens in a lot of different ways. But, it's if it's not built into the current system you have to make it happen somehow.
If this is not the right way to think about it, please tell me. But the idea that this is bringing to mind is in any kind of organization, maybe we have an innovation team, or maybe we have the Wizard of X, that I don't mean X like the platform. I mean XYZ or ABC something. And that's the man or woman or the team that comes up with skunk works like ideas, and so we bring them in to do novel thinking or to come up with ideas, but that in a lot of organizations, I think when we have this person or team, seems to me like one thing that is poorly executed as an organization is having that person tied to the realization of the ideas. It's more like we bring in somebody to have that diverse voice or that out of the box thinking. But then the people who are tasked with moving this project forward are the people who are, they all think alike. They all have a similar background. And I'm wondering if in your work with your clients, agencies, whatever, if you encounter this or if you see it similarly where it's like maybe it's not often the best structure to have one person or one team that is creative. They're the out of the box thinkers, but they're not involved in realizing that thinking.
Yeah. So a couple of things there. I mean, I think there's huge benefits to kind of upskilling your whole company on creativity. It creates a happier employee, creates a more fun workplace. It's a better culture. It makes them better at their job in many ways, more innovative. But again, not every project needs like a specialty creative team to come in to fix it. It's a reason why agencies kind of exist is because agencies can come in. A branding agency comes in and does a rebrand, does a new logo, does whatever. We will do a social media strategy for a company or a content strategy for a company, and we don't have to execute on that. They can run with it for quite a while and do good work. But then you have the larger problems like Ford realized they needed to kind of sell a cheaper car and that their whole infrastructure of how they build cars only had a certain lower price limit that they could reach. So they changed how they built cars by having a whole separate team from the entire company with a lot of risk ability, a lot of ability to absorb risk, to ignore risk, a lot of ability to be creative, and completely separate kind of production process that now they're rolling out to all of their vehicles over what will be a long time. Um, that is kind of a really big challenge that could not have been met by just upskilling people in their current roles and responsibilities. Dr. Pepper Keurig did a similar thing for trying to create reusable kind of coffee one-shotters that were safer for the environment. So companies will increasingly take these kind of risk of creating separate teams that can solve larger problems. But I think it's okay for, the average brainstorm to be a short meeting. It's okay for, having one person that's really good at being creative in a certain sector of a company and coming in and being kind of that hotshot person that can in a brief time period help someone. It's okay for agencies to come in and do that work. It's okay for an innovation team to come in and do that work and not have to complete projects. It just depends on how big the challenge is, how big the problem is, what the impact of that solution is going to be, and scaling up or down accordingly. So I think the bigger deal um, is really identifying that creativity is a probability game. And sometimes you need a small creative solution and you don't need a huge kind of scale to reach that solution. And sometimes you just have a really huge problem and the probability scale on that needs to be much bigger and takes a larger commitment or a more kind of risky solution of like an external team.
Do you get in situations where your work is sometimes largely restricted to helping your clients think more creatively or come up with ideas, but then as a partner for your clients, you aren't then involved in, taking that idea out into the world. So you're more of a consultant, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, we are a strategy consulting agency for most of the work we do. We do execute on paid media. We're very good at that. So we do the execution for some companies, but there's a lot of companies that bring us in simply for ideas. I mean, one of our products is the trends report. So we will come in quarterly and present to, sometimes it's just a performance team. Sometimes it's a organic social media team. Sometimes it's a full marketing department of, 50 people. But we'll come in and present kind of what is happening in social, on organic social side, on paid social side, with creative content. Like, what are the trends in content? What type of content is working from creators, from other brands, from competitors, from aspirational brands? Um, and that's simply just like giving people good ideas of like things that are being tried out there and working, and kind of widening their scope of what's possible, for creative content. Uh, we also do that when we develop a strategy. We also do that when we are, even down to like an SEO strategy, which doesn't sound like it could be that creative, but you do have to be creative, even more so today with SEO than you used to. So sometimes we'll execute, usually on the performance side, like we'll execute paid social, we'll execute SEO, um, paid media in general. But a lot of our work is kind of research, strategy, and giving an existing team kind of permission to go into a new direction.
If I think of your agency work as being maybe somewhat similar to Ford having a team that's going to be able to re-engineer the production process or something, then do you get into, yeah, well, in that case, I'm assuming that Ford's team can actually change a production line in an assembly line in one plant or another so that they can test things out. But do you get in situations on the agency side or consulting side for your clients where you're bringing ideas to the table or you're helping them think more creatively, and then, for one reason or another, there's pressure on you 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, because the client did not execute upon the ideas. And I'm not asking you to call out specific clients or anything. I'm just thinking more so when you do a workshop, or when you're the creative director, perhaps, or the strategist that comes in and you're helping push new thinking or new ideas, but then it's on someone else's plate, it's on the client's plate to actually go and do the work. Do you get in positions where the clients look back and they undervalue that time brainstorming or that thinking that you helped them do because the execution just wasn't there?
In general, I find people execute pretty well on what we give them. I think every agency has a little eye on what happens after they leave a client, or what happens when a client decides to go into a new direction. I mean, marketing teams have tons of turnover. If we worked with a client 2 years ago, there's not even a guarantee that one of the people we worked with is still at that company, right? So you never know what's going to happen at a company. Um, in general, though, I find our work gets executed on pretty well. It's in the numbers typically, like when we do a strategy, when we do trends reporting products, when we come in and help someone reset, or um, do a huge research report for them. I typically always do benchmarks, and we always follow that up 3, 6, 12 months later to see, if they're improving categories. And every single case, the numbers go up, according to our goals. So, it's, you know, I, I think sometimes you can't help that. Sometimes companies just can't do certain things, don't have the resources to, um, you know, to hit every goal. But I I think most marketing people, most creatives, know a good idea when they see one, and understand like a good strategy when they see one, and will run with it if they're capable of. So I don't see that as a typical problem, but I'm very realistic that it happens, and you can only do what you can do while you're there.
I'm also wondering if you have enough experience with creative thinking and creativity being a learned skill or having a process or whatever, if maybe I would see the lack of execution being more likely because you go into one of your clients and you have a process. You're doing a trends report, for example, or you're helping them think more creatively or whatever. And because you have a process, you have a way of training them up or educating them that facilitates the better execution. Whereas maybe in in my experience, right, either I lack that structure, or I've just been in places where I see a 3-hour brainstorming workshop, but then it's business as usual afterwards. And so maybe then I'm just more accustomed to a higher quote unquote failure rate?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to speak to other people's process or experience. I I do think. I mean, I we've been doing this work a long time. I've been inside of agencies. Our team has been inside of the biggest brands in the world on the brand side. Um, and I think I've seen enough of how not to do it to eventually you reach a place where you just know your work really well. So I will come into a work with a client. I mean, we've worked with, HubSpot and Robinhood and um, Credit Karma, some like pretty big brands, but we also have worked with like two-person team startups. And on both sides of that, I can come in and commonly see like a lot of red flags of, something that's not going to work. And I will bring those up proactively typically. I was like, we can do this for you, but I think one of the risk is you don't have a ad person on your team and your current agency is not doing great work because of XYZ. So we would recommend at least addressing those issues or hiring someone that you're going to need to execute on this. Or we don't think you'll be fully able to kind of take advantage of the opportunity we're presenting. So you try to like identify those problems up front when possible. And sometimes you have those conversations before a client hires you, specifically because you want to be just transparent about what it's going to take for them to get the most value out of it. But typically people are hiring you because they're missing something that you can provide and they want to invest in something more, but they don't know, they want to be more confident in the investment decisions they're going to make, whether that's spending on ads, whether that's spending on a social media team, transitioning to video production, whether that's spending on research. They're bringing you in as an expert to give them more confidence in that decision. And that's something we feel really confident doing because we've done it so often over the years.
At one point in the book, maybe multiple points, you talk about the value of holding on to your ideas, basically making notes. You have, whether it's a good idea or bad idea or just an idea, you talk about, well, more or less write it down. I don't know if you phrase it that way, but essentially. And immediately what I thought was, okay, there are people who just generally don't hold on to ideas. They're not note takers, whatever it is. And so they start writing things down. And I think that very often, I mean, I used to be one of these people, very often people will have a huge list and it becomes too difficult to sift through or find something. Now, we could talk about being able to search in Evernote or Apple Notes or whatever it is. But even with searching, I have to have an idea I have to have a sense. Let me separate idea and sense here. I have to have a feeling that I once had an idea about something, and then I can search for it. But what happens to a lot of folks is you get this super long list of ideas, and it's just too much to deal with. It's not structured. And so it becomes unusable. But then even for people who are note takers or they hold on to things, they often will lack an organization system or something else. And so when you talked about holding on to ideas or making notes or whatever it was in the book, I was really curious if you have a structure or if you talk to your clients about maybe don't just have a Google spreadsheet or, something in Notion or whatever, maybe have a process or an organization system so that those ideas become usable, easier to use later on.
I think that process is very specific to everyone. I don't have an exact process that I recommend everybody do, but essentially, like if you, most creative challenges are repeatable challenges that you have to overcome on a regular basis, whether it's writing headlines, do you write regular blog posts, do you have a annual marketing campaign that is going to come up every year in the same quarter. And because of that, just saving that process is very helpful. Like we will do rebranding projects for clients, sometimes coming into a new logo, coming into a new brand name. And naming a company is one of those places where scale is really helpful. Like coming up with thousands of name options is sometimes just what you have to do when you're trying to find the right name that you think is good, the research shows, the goals and the research show is good, but also the very particular opinion of a decision maker of the client has to be met as well. And that's sometimes difficult to pin down. Um, so there has to be a lot of process in naming. Like there's 20 different ways to come up with new names of a business, and each of those kind of have their own process. And we've defined those, and we have kind of list of thousands of names that we've done for other clients. So when we're doing a new one, we will go through and look and say, are any of these existing list of names of thousands of names that have never been used, are they available or worthwhile to bring into this new project? And not all of them will be, but it's a good place to start from. And I think that same process happens. The example in the book that I give is actually doing an annual campaign. And I think it was specifically the first billboard campaign for Spotify. Um, I forget the year, but they had an idea of using data in their billboards for the first time, like customer data, which sounds a little scary, but it's anonymized and it's kind of very specific regionally, like to the New York or to London or Paris, where the billboards were. So one of the examples of the billboard was, "Dear person who played 'I'm Sorry' 42 times on Valentine's Day, what did you do?" Like they're all hilarious billboards. Their advertising today still reflects this kind of data and humor and very kind of specific geography. But when they first came up with this idea, the creative team just didn't. It was pitched by the creative director, and the creative team just didn't get it. So he spent the next year, kind of coming back to that occasionally and just mocked it up. And once he mocked it up the next year, everybody saw it and got it right away. And they just needed a little more handholding to get that idea through. So like saving ideas that didn't work before, saving ideas that you haven't fully solved, it's always helpful. And I'm a big believer in keeping lists. I have dozens and dozens of lists that I've been keeping for years and years in my notes app on my iPhone. Um, some of them over a decade. My longest list is my more bad ideas list of just counterintuitive examples of creativity. And that's, I think, 400 or 500 items long. And that's where almost all of the book came from, is that list that I've been keeping for so long. So like that is a creative challenge I knew I would need, is those examples of counterintuitive creativity if I was going to prove that the nature of creativity is kind of not what you'd first guess. So you just have to identify what those creative challenges are, and either start keeping a list on it or have some other process of spreadsheets or something, or creative tools. A lot of social media software now can allow you to have idea boards and things like that. So I think it's just, you have to fit it to your specific need. But it's immensely important to have that database of ideas and potential connections to work from, and it saves you a lot of time. I have a blog post I wrote about how to be faster with your creativity, which isn't always possible, but it's a big demand on most creative people, is to come up with something good and fast. But one of the ways to be faster is to have that work done behind you, to have lists to keep bad ideas, to keep good ideas, to keep ideas that are almost there, and be able to pull from that database when a new challenge hits your desk.
So for what it's worth, the way that I found that it worked for me to address this challenge that I am describing, or I think a lot of people run into, is I just developed a process over time where when I have an idea, I just get it out of my head. So I could be driving somewhere, I'm listening to a podcast, they mention a book, and I think, that sounds like an interesting book. Or they mention a quote, or I'm in the equivalent of, I'm in the shower and I have a crazy idea, whatever, wherever I am. Some of them are not great places to make a note in my phone, but I could be driving and I could say, "Hey Siri," or whatever, make a note, send me an email, something to that effect. And I do it while I'm running. If I'm listening to an audiobook and I have a related thought, or just something that's completely out of left field, I usually have my AirPods in and I'll say, "Hey Siri, send me an email," and then I'll just dictate what the idea is. But the it, the place where I feel like a lot of people run into problems is that organization, like getting from the initial idea just out of your head and to a point and in a place where that thing becomes findable and usable. And so the process that I developed is basically, and of course, Siri's responding on my phone right now. And that has to happen, right? At least it wasn't on the computer. This method, I call it RAFT because the first step is an acronym. The first step is record. The next step is arrange. And basically, it's just instead of trying to, like, Jason, you have an idea, get it out of your head. That's the record step. Arrange is instead of trying to go back to that idea and start to knead and mold that bread dough into its final form, just get it from wherever it was. You sent yourself an email, for example, or you have a new Apple Note, since it sounds like you're an iPhone user. Instead of taking on a project, just take the next step. When you would pull out your phone normally, you're in an elevator, for example, or you're waiting in line at the grocery store or something, the time when you would check your email or you check Instagram for 30 seconds or whatever it is, instead, just open that note and figure out where it needs to go. So if you had an idea that's for a specific client that you're working on, it will take you 15 seconds probably to look at it and not even assess if it's a good idea or not. Just to say, oh, I should drop this in the notes folder for that client. And then we start to split things up. So it's no longer a pile of ideas, a single note. It is for you, maybe it's, oh, that clearly belongs in my more bad ideas note. And so let's just get it out of the general place and into that place. And then there are other steps. I call it, so that it fits with RAFT, I call it frame, which is that's the time where you work on it, and transmit. That's where you actually get it out into the world. I'm not trying to sell my structure here. This is what works for me. But more so, I mean, I think it's obvious to you that I feel like a lot of people just get buried under too many notes, and then it becomes unusable because it's like, it's akin to analysis paralysis. And so for me, and what I do advise people to do is, first of all, get it out of your head, but then don't try and eat the elephant all in one bite. Take the next small bite by just moving it over to the place where, for you, Jason, if it was a brand name, it might be like, I have a brand names note, and that is where I put it. It sounds like you said you don't have a process or a structure, something of that nature, but it sounds like you have one that, even if it was not intentionally developed, you have found something that it clearly works for you. There is a structure there.
I do exactly what you proposed, which is I do have notes for every client I have that I do write ideas into. And I have very specific things. So like will come up, I have not written a fiction book, and I ultimately do want to write a fiction book. And I have a note for character ideas. I have a note for book ideas, for plot ideas. So I have specific enough places for these things to go that when I come up with something I want to record, I kind of know where it's going to go. If I don't, I will start a new list. I will put it there. So, it's, again, that is my process. There is a little structure to that. I think people also have this problem when it comes to bookmarking things on social media. So when they created bookmarking folders, I think that was amazing, but still a lot of people don't go back and use those. I think putting something on your calendar on a regular basis, if it's something you really do want to start using more, you need to use more, if it's for a client, it's for work, it's for whatever, a repeatable problem that you have, a creative challenge that you have, putting something on the calendar to actually say, yeah, once a month, I'm going to go through this bookmarks folder, or once a month, I'm going to go through this list on my phone, or whatever it is. I think that's useful. We do this at our conference as well, where I give kind of the same recommendations for everybody that attends our conference, and I talk about it at the top of each show, which is pick one problem to focus on while you're at the conference. It doesn't mean it's not the only thing you have to learn while you're here, but it's the thing that will make the biggest difference if you're able to help solve it or make some impact. And then when you're listening to sessions, listen for stuff that will impact that one problem. When you're talking to people in the hallway, maybe ask questions about, has anybody figured out a way to do podcast promotion on TikTok? Because that's something we're struggling with. Working into conversations, like don't be overly obsessed with it, but look for opportunities in every interaction, every session to kind of, create that list of ideas that you can bring back to solve that problem. Um, and then specifically come back to it. So I ask people to set calendar reminders after the conference for, you know, next week, set a 7-day calendar reminder to come back and look at your notes, rewatch the sessions, and, actually put stuff into action, and even set additional calendar reminders of 30 and 60 days out to see if, to make sure you're actually putting stuff into action and moving on it. So yeah, I think the key is to have a system of some sort that allows you to organize your ideas and to come back to them. And that's kind of different for everyone, but I think putting stuff on the calendar is kind of the first step there.
So related to this, I wrote this down and I forget. Do you mention Stephen King in your book or no?
Yes, Stephen King threw away one of his manuscripts, and it took someone else realizing it was a good book for him to publish it. So it was in a part of the book where I talk about kind of the myth of solo creativity. Like everybody, even if you're the most creative person, other people are still involved in your creative process somehow in different ways. And the editing or kind of rallying around ideas, one of those ways. But yeah, I think that's the one mention of Steve. He's a wealth of like kind of creative process and recommendations. So, I think he has a lot to share.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, what gets called out a lot or recommended a lot is his book on writing, right? Because he talks about his process in there. And so you also mentioned fiction. So this relates in a number of ways. I think I follow you on Goodreads or something because I use Goodreads a lot. And I used to see you posting, or I used to see updates. Maybe it was from Kindle or something, or maybe you go in there directly, you reading a lot of fiction. So I'm going to come back to a different question about fiction in a second, but there is an interview. I could probably find it on YouTube. And if I do, I will link to it. But there's an interview between Stephen King and George R. Martin. And they're two really interesting people to have a discussion if you happen to be into fantasy or writing or whatever.
Yeah, they're both super talented.
Yeah. Stephen King asks George R. Martin, when you're writing and you have an idea or what you're going to do later in your story or for a character or for a new book or whatever else, what do you do with those ideas? And George R. Martin says he keeps everything in his head for the most part, which is, I'm going to be overly simplistic here and say the polar opposite of the way that Stephen King describes things. And, I think it's in On Writing, but then he's talked about it plenty of other places. He talks about he learned over time that for him to be the kind of writer that he wanted to be, to feel successful, productive, whatever his goals are, he found that he had to write 6 pages every day. And I forget if you talk about this exactly, but there's some relation nonetheless to you referencing Stephen King. And he talks about, I think it's in the interview with George R. Martin, he talks about that when he's writing one story and he has an idea for a different story, he will make a note. He has like a notepad or something next to him. I don't know exactly what the medium is, but he'll make a note of everything. It could be something that he has to pick up at the grocery store, or some accounting things that he has to do or whatever. And he will just get it out of his head. And then he will finish his 6 pages for the day. It's, at least as he describes it, it is only after he has finished his 6 pages for the day that then he'll do other things. He will go back to that list and say, oh, let me organize my different story ideas, or I had an idea about something that happened earlier in the story. Let me go back there. And I will tend to use this as an example of why organization matters for all of these creative off the wall ideas that we as human beings tend to have, that it helps to be organized because Well, I mean, I can look at least one example. Stephen King often publishes over 1,000 pages a year, in addition to travel and speaking and reviewing books and all that. And George R. R. Martin, being, I believe, Jason, a fantasy fan, you're probably well aware of this. I think it's been over 13 years now since he published the last book in A Song of Ice and Fire. And I might be wrong, but I think that a major contributing factor to him not being able to publish the next book is that he has a thought, and because he doesn't get it out of his head, I mean, how do I say to you, Jason, did you ever have a creative idea about XYZ? And have you know which specific idea I'm referring to? You know, when, like, how do you remember something that you're not remembering at the time? An easy way to do it is to have a list of ideas about a specific thing and go back to the list. You know, he has all these thoughts, but the memory is not reachable because he has to think about the thought first. I realize I'm getting into a bit of like an inception sort of thing. You have to have a thought about a thought about a thought here. And so anyway, I bring that up because I think this is just one example that, that where you see the value of writing down ideas. You know, Stephen King he's like the McDonald's of authors. You know, he's written 1 billion words and counting. And George R. R. Martin's a little bit different, but I think Stephen King is able to be so creative to see the production of it because he doesn't let himself get distracted by those ideas. He's focused, but he does get them out of his head.
I do think I couldn't write like that, like George R. R. Martin. I do specifically when I have ideas when I'm writing, I will, you know, I will bracket stuff or put it in a side list to come back to. So I would probably prescribe to Stephen King's way of writing, but I also think it's good. Like he has a minimum number of pages. Like staying productive is very interesting. But everyone comes back to having to edit things in their own style. I'm not sure. I I love reading fiction. There's several fantasy fiction, sci-fi authors that have gotten this multi-book series world where they kind of wrote themselves into a corner, or it's just taking a long time to live up to the expectations. And humans are messy, so who knows what's going on in their lives. But I think most reasonable people need to keep good notes on things to be able to make complex stories and complex solutions kind of come together.
Am I wrong in thinking that it is counterintuitive it's counter to stereotype at the very least to think that a creative thinker or an artist, an innovator would be organized, would have some sort of structure or process?
No, I mean, I think some are and some aren't. I don't think you have to be organized to be creative. I think it can help in a lot of endeavors. But, like if you're working on something very complex, you kind of need like a schema. You need like some type of system thinking to really understand large topics or complex topics. But if you're a painter, you can famously see a piece of cheese melting and get an idea for a painting, as the story in the book goes. And that's what you're going to paint. Like it's some creative challenges are not as complex and you require just more taste than, engineering or topic specific knowledge. It requires just actively perfecting that skill, and that point of view. So, I'm not a believer that all creatives should have like a messy desk or all creatives need a very structured workplace environment to achieve a good outcome. I think it's different for everyone, different for every kind of specific creative challenge. I think you see that all across the board. Like some people think you need to drink and do drugs to be creative. Some people think that ruins creativity. And you can actually find studies on both sides of that. I think it's just more about finding what works for you. Like that's why I wrote the book in a way that is literally just a list of interventions, a list of tools, because I think everyone is very unique and specific, and what works for them is going to, they're going to know that better than I do.
I think that the context is so important that it's difficult probably for us to disagree exactly on this, but I will support my belief that more structure, more process, more organization is generally more valuable by saying, so you talk about the Seinfeld's Pop-Tart joke in the book, and you use it as an example of, I think, a long creative arc or something like that. And I forget exactly how you characterize it, but the thing that I have always come back to with Seinfeld is he talks about this in, I think, two documentaries about him. One is The Comedian, I think is called. And then there's another one, I forget what. But he tells a story of sitting in a coffee shop in New York every morning and seeing construction workers walk by. You may very well know this story. And he starts thinking to himself, they go to work every day, rain or shine, whether they are tired or not, whether they want to or not. And this is part of how they're able to have a career, is that they do the job even when they don't want to. And one way or another, maybe he describes it, he jumps to, maybe this has some relation to why so many comedians are hot for a year or two or three, and then you never hear from them again. Because in his experience, a lot of comedians wait for the creative bug to strike them. And if they have a writer's block sort of situation, then they might go years without a new idea for a joke. And so he says this is when he began sitting down and more or less 9 to 5 every day, he writes jokes. And, he also talks about in one of these documentaries that he's always been, he has the yellow legal pads and the Bic pens or something like that. And I think they show a picture in one of these documentaries. And you touch on some aspect of this. I forget exactly how, but I often will go back to, and I did in my mind when I read you talking about the Pop-Tart joke, the part that I focus on a lot is sitting down and doing the job even when you don't want to. And, that if your job is it benefits from creative thinking, that not waiting to just have an idea, not waiting until you're in the shower or you're out on a run or whatever to have that creative thought. I do think that those are valuable times. And you kind of talk about that as well in the book, but also saying that I should have some dedicated time to come up with ideas. I should have some structure, some organization. And again, having described all of that, like I said, I think context for each individual and each organization matters so much that it's a little bit difficult to disagree here, as much as to say, for me personally, when I read that Pop-Tart joke um, bit in your book, that section, what I thought about was, I've just always focused so much not on the long creative arc as much as the discipline or the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it is creativity is active. You have to put it into practice. The more you do, the better you'll be at it. So, Seinfeld's right. The example in the book for the Pop Tart joke is he works on jokes for months, and that's editing mostly, right? He'll come back to jokes and really refine things to get them right. So there's an experience factor there. There's a taste factor there. There's a willing to work longer on a problem than other people often get you to a more creative result. All of those things are happening. Sometimes it's also just incubation, giving yourself more time to let your subconscious work at something. Um, so yeah, I think you have to have a process, but I think it's less about process and it's more about finding something that works for you and doing it consistently and coming back to it repeatedly so you get better at it. Like that's, the iterative growth there is important. Um, I I also think you have to build up inspiration in your world, and inspiration is kind of messy. You can't really schedule inspiration. You can't really put a process by it, but you can constantly just make sure you're surrounding yourself with interesting things, interesting media, interesting people, interesting conversations. Like that is I call that brushing up against life. And that is, I think, an underrated part of creativity. Um, you could work really hard at your craft and do really great things with it. But if you're not introducing new things into your own life, into your own mind on a regular basis, then you're not feeding that capability really well. So there's a lot of pieces to this, but I think finding the process that works for you, repeating it, getting good at it, and making sure you have interesting things, new ideas that are different from your own perspective coming into your life on a regular basis is those are core pieces of a talented creative person's life.
Jason, where should I go if I want to learn more? Obviously, I've read the book. I believe you have your own website. You have Social Fresh's website. There are social media channels. Where should I go to learn more or connect if I'm curious about book and this thinking? And then also, are there things that you would want to reinforce, double down on, words of wisdom, or even maybe things that we didn't touch on that you feel like, hey, before we end this conversation, let's get this statement out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, like my whole philosophy is anyone can be more creative. So if you're trying to have a better solution in marketing or some other part of your life, that creativity is an active process. It takes work, it takes practice, but it's fun. So find ways to do that. It can be games, it can be reading, it can be going to a coffee shop, talking to strangers, like whatever it is. There's tons of ways to do it, and I give a lot of examples in the book. Um, where you can find more, my newsletter, moreabadideas.com, is where I write about creativity and marketing. If you're ever interested in our agency or our social media conference, our next conference is coming up in March in New York City in 2026. You can just go to socialfresh.com for information on that. And I think one thing I'll add that we didn't touch on today is we have started playing with AI and creativity. And I think it's interesting because I think it really reinforces everything we talked about today. A lot of people use AI for kind of brainstorming, and it's great for like an initial list of directions and options for things, titles or campaign ideas or whatever. Um, but it starts to feel a little kind of blah pretty quickly because it is an amalgamation of everything that's already been done in the world, right? So there's not a lot of new ideas there. I think it can help. But to make AI good at creativity, there's a couple things you can do, and we have prompts. My newsletter, you actually get a lot of these prompts that we've made for creativity AI prompts. Most of them are marketing based for context, but to make it better, one of the things you can do is you can train it to do a specific task based on how a creative does it. So like one of them is coming up with names. So we've trained an AI prompt basically on how a human would do it. It's just telling it how a specific human would be creative in that role is very useful. Another way to make it better is iteration. By saying, hey, give me 20 ideas. I'm going to tell you my favorites, number them, and then do that again, and then do it again, and do it again. And you can get through hundreds of ideas in minutes by just giving it feedback. And none of this is perfect, but I think that's interesting because these same steps that I outline in the book are also how you would make AI more creative. It's how humans and AI both can be more creative. So they're repeatable and they're tested. And I think, making sure that you're building up a skill set that you're getting better at and making sure that you're feeding that skill set with more interesting ideas on a regular basis. Those are kind of some of the core elements.
Yeah, I wish we had more time because there was a point in the conversation earlier even where I think it was you were talking about having hundreds or thousands of brand name ideas, something like that. And I was thinking, you know, having a big list and being able to say, okay, here is the list of names that I've liked before. Now, here's the challenge that's ahead of me. Here's the client details or whatever. Which of these, and perhaps even which new ideas might you have that would give me a list of options? And so we could talk so much about AI, but I had thought about that earlier. I know we just had more time, but I will throw in here as well that let me support what you were saying about multiple rounds. Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people who just start, somebody says, "Oh, you should use ChatGPT," and they go and try something, or maybe it's not ChatGPT. They use whatever. They try something, and the first round that they get back is not good, and then they think, "Well, this is just terrible. AI is really dumb," or something of that nature. And I feel like it's I was just willing to play, I guess, earlier on or deal with rounds of things not working such that after saying, no, that's not good, or no, I don't like it like that, or can you give me more like this? I would get to something that I thought was a really good output. But it, maybe it's related to having bad ideas. Or one of the questions I asked earlier, if you're not willing to go through some work, then it's very unlikely that you're going to have AI help you be creative.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best use of AI for creative output are the most creative people using these tools. Like if you're a good video editor, you're going to do better at getting VO3 to produce a really good video result. So the human skill is still pretty important.
Okay, Jason, I know we're short on time and I don't want to have you bump right up to whatever's coming next. So I will largely wrap it here and say, I recommend your book. I really liked it. I think this was the perfect length. And actually, it was really well written for what you present and what I think what you've said you're trying to accomplish. So I think it's great. I think it's actually a really good resource. I don't know if you give it to your clients or sell it to your clients, but I would imagine, without being too self-promotional or whatever, if I was in your shoes, I actually do think that this is a great resource for your clients. So I recommend your book. I appreciate you being here, especially after not having any digital or real world interaction for, I don't know, 15 years or something. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it, Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. My pleasure.